When I look at the Midwest as a player in the global economy, it's clear we have tremendous impact. And we have tremendous impact not just in one vertical, but across the real value chain that every industry needs, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's logistics, whether it's ag biosciences and agricultural production, whether it's pharmaceuticals and life sciences. When you look at the Midwest, the diversity of what we can generate and what we do generate is powerful. I mean, think about it as a mutual fund. If you think about the Midwest as a mutual fund, it's incredibly well balanced. We have an opportunity to drive more growth as we think about how do we link arms and how do we think about growing this economy in a way that does connect tech to ag, to logistics, to manufacturing. That's where I think we can go from being the player we are today to the player that's even bigger globally than we are now.
Jason, you're several episodes in on #Midwest now as a podcast platform. When you think about where that's come in just several episodes, how do you see the roadmap? What's the evolution of #Midwest looking like for you?
So we're essentially trying to use a platform, something like #Midwest, to encompass a number of things underneath it that are important for our growth in the Midwest. So we have a particular channel called Executive Stories. We're trying to tell the stories of executives and the great leadership that we have. But also, and we also have things that are focused on startups and our cities and our culture and our technology. And we're not just talking about our strengths, we're also talking about the gaps, the things that are likely need to be filled for us to really do well. And the other thing that I think is probably really compelling about this, and it's our focus on challenging the things that we hear every single day. You know, the fact that our culture is a particular way. We want to actually dig into that and go a level deeper, and we want to go out there and ask those questions of people that are doing it every day. And so we actually had an opportunity to go out and talk to quite a few individuals across a variety of disciplines. So we have CEOs of startup accelerators, in fact the largest in the world. We talked to the CEO of 1871. We have people that have built startup accelerators in other cities, corporate innovation people in manufacturing and agriculture, which I would consider classic Midwestern industries, as well as people in product and engineering and sort of the technical folks.
So as you had those conversations over the last couple of weeks, what were some of the strengths that bubbled up?
Yeah, so you know what's interesting is these people have varied backgrounds, but they all had a lot of overlap in terms of the perceived strengths of the Midwest, and the perceived weaknesses as well. Probably the most interesting out of the gate was one from a gentleman named Brian Ardinger. Now he has got an interesting background. He started his career in Hong Kong and moved to Silicon Valley, so he's got some experience, a global experience as well as on the coasts. And then he came back to Lincoln, Nebraska to start a startup accelerator called In Motion, and which has done very, very well. He also has started a podcast in Lincoln called InsideOutside.io. And the thing that he talked about, which I thought was so interesting, was, I would just call it generally access. So access to things like, it's literally 2 phone calls away, and I'm able to speak to anybody I need to get access to talent and many, many other things.
Yeah, so I think some of the core advantages that Midwest startups have is access to customers, access to a network, and access to kind of existing businesses, and being able to reframe and remix and reshape old industries into whatever is going to happen next, and be able to take those existing customer bases and those existing tools and really reshape them for the new world of work. So the fact that the Midwest has a huge customer base, and basically it's a massive market. It's much bigger than a lot of fleet people think of. You think of the flyover states, you don't often think of a big economic impact, but places like the Midwest have access to customers and access to talent that you can't necessarily have on the East and West Coast. It's a different access. Again, a lot of the existing industries that have happened and have grown up from the Midwest, and your ability to access that capital, that talent, that network, I think is extremely valuable for new companies. Again, trying to solve real problems. It's different than a new app that you want to create. It's about really how do we solve core problems that we've been facing from the beginning, and how do we evolve and change and grow as the world changes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great benefits of being with the Midwest. So the Midwest nice and the startup community, and what we have here with all of our enterprises, organizations that have been here for decades and decades, is that ease of networking. Like, we want to help each other. We want to collaborate. We want to build up this community in a new perception of the Midwest. So when it comes to, supporting our startup or, connecting with other executives, it's actually very easy. You just have to be able to find the right person and the right topic, and then, follow-up calls and meetings, they just happen, and everybody wants to help.
So we heard some great clips from Mitch, Indiana. I know you've had several other conversations about the access piece and the strengths of the region. Help me understand, when you go back to back with 6 or 7 people, did your perception of access to networks change at all?
Probably not access to networks. I think, if you were to think about access from a city perspective, my experience, and I think most people's experience, is you get the help you need. I mean, it is very simple in our locale to find people you need and really network efficiently and effectively. And I think the things that they were talking about were absolutely spot on. But the challenge, I think, is we rarely talk about the ability for us to gain access across cities. We don't talk about across states very often. We don't talk about across the region, and I think the challenge with that is the region is really the primary focus, and oftentimes we kind of miss the big picture there, and we're not necessarily sure how we're building connections to those ecosystems, and it's not clear to me for sure. And I think we just need to do a much better job. And that frankly is one of the reasons why we are trying to build #Midwest into this regional focus, so that we can actually use the strengths of these cities and across the entire region. One of the things that when we were talking about access that we didn't talk deeply about in those clips was really access to talent. I know that's something that you are very, very familiar with and spend a lot of your time in. What do you think about these statistics? 35% of the higher, bigger universities and institutions, research universities, are here in the region, and those graduate 33%. I think was the number. 33% of STEM graduates right from this region. What do you make of those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, those can be those are surprising figures, right? For many people, I think what it points to is some misperception about the region and its ability to produce the talent that's necessary to supply or fill the pipeline of talent needs for companies in the region. I also think it points to a lack of alignment. Right. I think that's the biggest challenge here, is not necessarily the inability for universities to recognize and technical colleges to recognize the need for themselves to innovate, for their campuses to innovate, their programs to innovate. That's old news. That's been going on now for at least a few years, much earlier than that in many situations. I do think there's this lack of alignment between, it's just two different languages. What employers are thinking about and articulating, what universities are producing in terms of talent, and how those individuals are able to articulate their strengths and their readiness to deliver value, that's where we miss each other a little bit. And so to me, it's a significant ongoing challenge to sort of lift up the dialogue and bring those entities together so we can really start working through those types of issues in more impactful ways.
We have tremendous talent in the Midwest, young to more senior, with several of the top-ranked universities in the world based in the Midwest, including several of the top-ranked engineering and computer science programs. If you are inside one of the Midwestern cities and you're looking out, I think there's also a gap. So major corporations don't think the technical talent is here, and technical talent do not think the jobs are here, and both couldn't be further from the truth, right? That talent is absolutely here and the jobs are absolutely here, but we have a matching problem. And the matching problems aren't hard to fix. They're way easier to fix, at least, than creating demand or creating supply.
So I think some of the advantages that we bring is the access to talent, and that talent obviously comes from universities and places where we're educating youth and opportunities to create new research and things along those lines. So I believe there's a huge opportunity if we tap into not only educating our youth and giving them an opportunity to learn new things, but then teaching them how to apply that, and not just learn the theoretical things around that, but how do you create value and create new businesses based on what you've learned, and know that you don't have to go to the coast to get that idea, kicked off. Ev Williams, the founder of Twitter, is from Nebraska, and he went to the University of Nebraska and eventually moved and left for the coast and built Twitter. I don't want the next Ev Williams in 25 years to have to go to Silicon Valley to create the next Twitter. And that's why I work strongly in the startup ecosystem. Is like, how do we create an environment, a healthy environment where those seeds can be planted? You can start a company, you can raise your hand and say, I want to be an entrepreneur, and you're not laughed out of the room. And I think we're doing that now. I think all around the Midwest, you're seeing these cities and these ecosystems that are popping up that are giving the rise for people with talent to say, hey, I want to start something. How do I do that? How can I get networked? And then how can I grow and build that? And so in the next 20 years, we're going to see the fruits of that labor paying off.
It's interesting, as we all know, there's no shortage of stories of people that have migrated away from the Midwest and created incredible juggernauts, companies that have just been thriving. They've done that in other places. But as Brian mentioned, I think the idea is, how do we create more fertile ground essentially for startups and the startup ecosystem? How do we incubate more companies, more early stage companies? But as you and I know, that is absolutely not the entire story.
Yeah, no, that's right. The digitalization of industries. Every industrial revolution improves industries like healthcare, like energy, transportation, manufacturing, etc. And the digitalization of all of those industries has been accelerated by a decade over the last 10 months. Think about the proliferation of telemedicine, virtual learning, work from anywhere, work from home. These dynamics, they're not going back, right? We're not going back to where we were. And so every job in every industry is now impacted. And that's not to say that every job becomes a tech job, but what it does say is that digitalization, digital technologies are going to be deployed, and that's going to mean that there's going to be a shift in the job market, and there's going to be a need for reskilling and upskilling. And when you look at the data that came out just a couple of months ago, in late October actually, from the World Economic Forum, what they talk about is that 50% of the workforce needs to be reskilled. So what should be a bigger concern right now is not the demographic cliff related to higher education, where the 20 million people enrolled in higher ed right now is expected to decline by 2026. And that too has been accelerated by the pandemic. But what is more concerning is that only 4% of people age 25 and up are enrolled in any sort of learning program at all right now. So as we think about reskilling over the next 5 years, that's the major challenge facing many of these companies in the Midwest.
Well, the challenge we have within our industry, especially manufacturing, is just the growth that we are seeing is keeping a workforce in the volume of workforce needed to keep up with the demand. So with that comes a lot of automation, a lot of Industry 4.0 type of technology coming in. And so what you'll do is start seeing the shift of having a lot of those people in traditional net workforce moving into another level as more automation is going in. It's not that we're eliminating jobs, it's just the jobs are going to shift now, allowing you to move to the next level of how to work within an Industry 4.0 type of environment. And that's just going to continue to fuel more possibilities within the area.
Yeah, I think people should have their eye on the Midwest in the next decade and more for a number of reasons. We touched on one of them earlier, and I'll just put it at the top of the list, which is, Midwest is a producer of tangible things. So much attention and capital has been focused on digital. So I really think, tech could play a supporting role in, manufacturing and hardware and advanced manufacturing. And I think we are ripe to be the leaders, not the followers in, advanced manufacturing, green tech, and some of the other stuff we talked about. I think some of the other things that really make the Midwest stand apart is we're in the middle of this, what people are calling the new urban crisis, where these superstar cities really just aren't affordable for, anybody in the service economy and even people in the creative class. So, I think one of the main draws of these cities is, the restaurants and the experiences, and the education is just going to disappear. So I think these secondary hubs that the Midwest is just full of are really ripe to replace them. That gets exacerbated by sort of the Zoomtown movement that we've seen this year. This portability of talent, people not needing to live where they work. And the tools like Teams and Miro that lets you be really collaborative and effective online day to day. So, I think that, we have the slow and sustained growth in our cities that make them those attractive places like Zach Brandon's been able to show off. I think the last thing I'd say is just a really untapped labor pool that, we have a lot of under-challenged creative people and, underrepresented and ignored populations. So I kind of think of it as, this is the Moneyball moment for your human resources team to, let's stop fighting over the overcomped crew, and let's find those people that can do the job just as well.
So Jesse's comment about the Moneyball moment really resonated with me. I think it absolutely crystallizes, maybe perfectly, how corporations need to be thinking about the opportunity. I do think it also highlights for me the responsibility, I would say, leadership in corporations, the responsibility that they need to take to pay attention to employees. And there's a big cultural shift sort of afoot in this digital transformation. I think we need to work with our employees, really understand their strengths and build them up and try to focus on the things that we know they can do. There's incredibly talented people in our companies right now that are getting very little focus, and they're not working on their development. I think as we all know, the world is sort of going at a much faster rate in terms of skills. There's so much that I think people need to learn, and so the way we train and develop and upskill our staff has got to catch up, and that's a leadership issue. So in my mind, I think leaders need to do a much better job at understanding and being empathetic, know how to build teams, know how to develop their associates, and some are doing well, but that remains a very, very big gap. I do think the vision for #Midwest is true, and I know you believe it too, that we are positioned right now for amazing growth. I think the opportunity is right there. We see exactly where we need to go, but we can't focus our energy and emphasis on one thing. It can't be only about talent. I think it needs to be on the overall system.
I think there is tremendous opportunity for us to focus on venture attraction, but it's a red herring to some degree to just focus on the capital. Capital is available. It's up to us as leaders to identify those companies, to create the infrastructure, to create the fabric that supports those companies to attract that capital. And what I mean by that is, I do think there's more need for capital, but capital alone won't solve our problem. What has to happen is we have to think about this as a system, not just a node. We have to think about this as, what are we doing to ensure that we foster great ideas and the transfer of great ideas? We have to think about this of, how do we ensure we have the right talent, the startup DNA, to take action on these ideas, and how do we make sure we have a supporting infrastructure of capital to go do that? So capital alone is not enough. Capital is a key part of it, but it's got to be capital, it's got to be people, and it's got to be ideas if this thing's going to work.
One of the places that you've got a great deal of experience, certainly a lot more than I do, is innovation, creating innovation inside of a large organization. Based on the conversations that you've had over the last week or so, and even on your own set of beliefs, what do you think about the challenges and opportunities in terms of innovation inside of a large company?
Right. I think it is definitely, I would characterize it as a gap. And it's natural. I mean, if you think about what large organizations are doing, they're built to be operationally efficient and, good at what they do. So oftentimes, as I think everyone is aware, the culture is not built for the messiness of exploration and invention and innovation. And so, it rejects these attempts to do interesting and novel things, and that's a challenge because we really do need our corporations to figure out better ways to build innovation or encourage innovation. The other thing I think is probably a big challenge is our corporations don't necessarily know how to think about and consume failure. So failure in a large organization is, you sort of drag a can around you, behind you for the rest of your career. Where in really innovative spaces, failure is a badge of honor in a lot of ways. If you can do it and get back up and kind of learn from it. So I think I think big corporations don't really look at building a safe to fail environment as a way to encourage learning.
Talking about the Achilles heel of large corporations being able to have an innovation culture, I think that is an Achilles heel. Our strategy group tries to advise on creating an innovation, internal innovation group inside of a regular community, a regular corporation. And what our research has found, both primary and just looking across other research, is that oftentimes the first iteration doesn't work. It's either poorly formed as an innovation group, or the host rejects it. And so we found that the corporations that allow the innovation group to fail at least once are the most successful, because it's going to happen. So whatever you build that first time isn't going to work. It's the second or third time. So if you have that patience, I think it's possible to let that transform. The second part about acquisition, I'm glad that you re-asked the question, because it made me think a little bit more about it and what would allow acquisition of startups to actually impact the bottom line or the culture or the strategy of a larger corporation. And there is such a mismatch of scale at the beginning, especially when an acquisition happens, because it, oftentimes to make it financially viable, it's a pretty small startup when it's acquired versus the acquirer. So I do like seeing internal venture groups investing in those startups and letting them stay independent, and even allowing them to be acquired by a different company if necessary, allowing them to get to the scale where they would actually have a voice, have a seat at the table at the larger group. And that, I think, would allow the larger corporation to see how this could be a significant part of their go forward strategy, revenue, whatever it might be.
I think one of the challenges startups face and corporations face here when it comes to innovation is the fact that innovation is very different, and starting a brand new company or a brand new idea is different than running an existing business. If you think about the largest companies in the Midwest, and they've been around for hundreds of years, and they haven't had a founder that's been driving that organization for hundreds of years. They've built these businesses, and they continue to operate these business models that have been around for a long time. The challenge is that those business models are changing, and you need new people and new faces and new ways of tackling those new business models to adapt and change and to these new market forces. And that speed of change is accelerating. So if you think about, you used to be able to be on that S&P 500 list for 60 years. And I think the new research shows that, the chances of you being on that list for a long period of time is, down to 12 to 14 years. And so you have to, if you're running a major corporation, you have to think more entrepreneurially. You have to think about this business model that I'm currently optimizing and building may not be around in the next 10, 15 years. So how do I think more entrepreneurially? How do I create new value and change the way I'm doing business in an environment where, quite frankly, you haven't had to stretch those muscles in the past before?
Listening to that, my big takeaway from Jesse and Brian was not really focused on large companies alone. Big company or small, there are many 100-year-old companies in the Midwest, and multi-generational companies, and many of those are coming up demographically right now for another wave of transfer of ownership, and that was all pre-pandemic. What really hit me from both of their comments was related to a culture of learning, and a culture of learning that leads to a culture of innovation. I think that's so important. Not just that piece of allowing for failure, but just this cycle of continuously learning and continuously growing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I do believe that building safe to fail cultures, organizations, I think that by itself is going to take an amazingly long time potentially to accomplish. But I'm not even sure necessarily that we know how to promote our own successes, our own wins.
What do you mean by that?
So, there are things that are happening inside of our organizations, outside of our organizations, in the startup ecosystem. There are things that are really important to our growth, and we're not sharing those well. I think the challenge there is that we're putting a lot of emphasis potentially on the wrong things even. We might be celebrating a hard-fought victory from in some project or some company, but do we really know what is most important to focus on? And do we ever talk about the people that work on a really, really hard and sticky problem that's important to our culture? Do we talk about those people, and maybe they failed, but they advanced the ball for us, right? So I'm just not sure that we really know how to focus on what we pay attention to as corporations and maybe as a region?
I think when we look at the perception of the Midwest from others, it's very easy to look at hardworking, diligent, really focused, and we should all take a great deal of pride in that. But the opportunity for us is to celebrate the successes of those who have taken big risks and shown big returns. We see it on the coast. We have to bring it here. I look here in Indiana at a great young company called Exact Target that started when 3 guys came from Chicago and started a digital marketing tech company in the early 2000s. It was a big deal. That was a big risk. And you know what happened? They took that company public. I was part of it in 2012 when we went public on the New York Stock Exchange. Then, one of the biggest SaaS, software as a service IPOs in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. And then a little over a year later, we're acquired by Salesforce for $2.5 billion. That's one story. We've got to tell that story. We've got to tell more stories like that, and not just tell those stories, but create those stories. That is what will attract more people, ideas, and capital to our region.
I think most of the world, or certainly most of the United States, still uses the phrase fly by state or fly over state, right? They land in Chicago to change planes, but they're not coming into downtown or going into Milwaukee or Indianapolis or Minneapolis, etc. And so I think there's a perception gap, and I think the opportunity we have there is to tell our story better, which I think is part of, at least certainly from what I understand, a major thrust of what #Midwest is trying to do, which is how do we tell an integrated story about the Midwest? I mean, I think frankly, there's an opportunity to tell an integrated story about Chicago, the top-down Chicago story, the top-down Milwaukee story, the top-down Des Moines story, right? Like, what does that look and feel like, and then how do those things ladder up, and how do we operate as an integrated network, certainly better than we do today, where it becomes undeniable.
I'm just thinking about the conversations that we just listened to parts of. It feels like in a relatively short period of time, you had 6 or 7 conversations that covered a lot of ground about some really critically important topics.
Yeah, I think it definitely feels like that, but honestly, I don't think we even scratched the surface. There just seems to be so much noise in the system. There's so many conversations. Obviously, the Midwest in general is a very large region, and there's so many distinct conversations happening, and it's very difficult to know what we need to do to improve our situation. I think #Midwest, the wonderful thing that I think our vision for this is to figure out how to take and find the signal in all of that noise and really bring the most important elements of what's important to this conversation to the forefront. So we're developing, we're under the #Midwest umbrella, we're creating shows and channels that are really focused on a diversity of topics, things that really are important for the entire system to improve. So we started with executive stories, and I think that was a really important one to start with because there are some wonderful, wonderful leaders in our communities, and we're having conversations. We're trying to understand a bit more of how they think, what have they done that has been important, what are things that other people can do and replicate. Just think that's an incredible opportunity to really engage with great leaders. We're going to be, I know you're going to be starting a channel that's specific to the future of work.
Yeah, we're working on that right now and creating some really great content around that issue of the world of work. I've sort of stopped using the term future of work because I after all of the research and what's going on in the last 10 months, what I've learned is that the future of work is right now. We've seen about a decade's worth of acceleration in so many different ways, but that includes the evolution of jobs when we think about work from home, work from anywhere, and all of the digitalization of industry and so forth. So we're working on bringing some global thought leaders to the equation to infuse into the conversation, as well as finding those people across the region who are thought leaders in their own right around the world of work.
Well, and I think that in particular is an incredibly important part of what I think the Midwest is really needing, and the conversation needs to get more structured, and I think the plan for that is awesome. We're also looking at Midwest road trips, which is really just an interesting...
I want to do one or two of those.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think the Midwest road trip idea is really how do we pay attention to the cultural elements of the Midwest and put some energy into shining a spotlight on the most important parts of our incredible cities. I mean, there are some in very, very important and fun and interesting places, the amenities, the things that there are to do that we don't talk about enough, and I think highlighting those regularly will be a lot of fun. But beyond that, we're looking at spinning up channels in what I would consider classic Midwestern industries. You know, things like agriculture and manufacturing and logistics. You know, we pioneered those industries, and we have some incredible people inside of our region that are really, really talented and really understand that domain. And I think we need to shine a bit more of a light on the things that are happening inside of those natural advantages we have, and those definitely are natural advantages for us. And I think, you know, by and large, there's other shows, and we've had conversations with other folks that, you know, really have an interest in contributing and being part of a really important cause here, you know, to try to get out there and tell the story. But in general, I think #Midwest is really well positioned to amplify those signals so that we can describe the why and the how the Midwest itself is really positioned for explosive growth.